Thylacine. The Thylacine, /ˈθaɪləsiɪn/THY-lə-syne, or /ҭaɪλασɪν/THY-lə-syne, also /ҭaɪləsin/, from ancient Greek theta lambda alpha kappa omicron sigma thúlakos, pouch, sac plus Latin inus, Thylacinus cynocephalus, now extinct, is one of the largest known carnivorous marsupials, evolving about 4 million years ago. The last known live animal was captured in 1933 in Tasmania. It is commonly known as the Tasmanian tiger because of its striped lower back, or the Tasmanian wolf because of its canid-like characteristics. It was native to Tasmania, New Guinea, and the Australian mainland. The Thylacine was relatively shy and nocturnal, with a general appearance of a medium to large-sized dog, except for its stiff tail and abdominal pouch similar to a kangaroo, and dark transverse stripes that radiated from the top of its back, reminiscent of a tiger. The Thylacine was a formidable apex predator, though exactly how large its prey animals were is disputed. Because of convergent evolution, it displayed a form and adaptations similar to the tiger and wolf of the northern hemisphere, even though not related. Its closest living relative is either the Tasmanian devil or the numbat. The Thylacine was one of only 2 marsupials to have a pouch in both sexes, the other is the water opossum. The pouch of the male Thylacine served as a protective sheath covering the external reproductive organs. The Thylacine had become extinct on the Australian mainland before British settlement of the continent, but it survived on the island of Tasmania along with several other endemic species, including the Tasmanian devil. Intensive hunting encouraged by bounties is generally blamed for its extinction, but other contributing factors may have been disease, the introduction of dogs, and human encroachment into its habitat. Taxonomy. Numerous examples of Thylacine engravings in rock art have been found dating back to at least 1000 BC. Petroglyph images of the Thylacine can be found at the Dampier Rock Art Precinct on the Burrup Peninsula in Western Australia. By the time the first European explorers arrived, the animal was already extinct in mainland Australia and rare in Tasmania. Europeans may have encountered it in Tasmania as far back as 1642 when Abel Tasman first arrived in Tasmania. His shore party reported seeing the footprints of wild beasts having claws like a tiger. Mark Joseph Marion Dufresne, arriving with the Mascaron in 1772, reported seeing a tiger cat. Positive identification of the Thylacine as the animal encountered cannot be made from this report since the tiger gual, Dasyurus maculatus, is similarly described. The first definitive encounter was by French explorers on May 13, 1792, as noted by the naturalist Jacques Le Billardier, in his journal from the expedition led by d'Entrecasteaux. In 1805 William Patterson, the Lieutenant Governor of Tasmania, sent a detailed description for publication in the Sydney Gazette. He also sent a description of the Thylacine in a letter to Joseph Banks dated March 30, 1805. The first detailed scientific description was made by Tasmania's Deputy Surveyor General, George Harris in 1808, 5 years after first European settlement of the island. Harris originally placed the Thylacine in the genus Didelphis, which had been created by Linnaeus for the American opossums, describing it as Didelphis cynocephala, the dog-headed opossum. Recognition that the Australian marsupials were fundamentally different from the known mammal genera led to the establishment of the modern classification scheme, and in 1796, Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire created the genus Dasyurus where he placed the Thylacine in 1810. To resolve the mixture of Greek and Latin nomenclature, the species name was altered to Cynocephalus. In 1824, it was separated out into its own genus, Thylacinus, by Temminck. The common name derives directly from the genus name, originally from the Greek theta lambda alpha kappa omicron sigma, thúlakos, meaning pouch or sac. Evolution. The modern Thylacine probably appeared about 2 million years ago, during the early Pleistocene. Pliocene-aged specimens from the Pliocene-aged chinchilla fauna, described as Thylacinus rostralis by Charles Davis in 1894, is now attributed to this species. Species of the family Thylacinidae date back to the beginning of the Miocene. Since the early 1990s, at least 7 fossil species have been uncovered at Riverslea, part of Lawn Hill National Park in northwest Queensland. Dixon's Thylacine, Nimbacinus dixoni, is the oldest of the 7 discovered fossil species, dating back to 23 million years ago. This thylacinid was much smaller than its more recent relatives. The largest species, the powerful Thylacine, Thylacinus potens, which grew to the size of a wolf, was the only species to survive into the late Miocene. In late Pleistocene and early Holocene times, the modern Thylacine was widespread, although never numerous, throughout Australia and New Guinea. An example of convergent evolution, the Thylacine showed many similarities to the members of the dog family, Canidae, of the Northern Hemisphere: sharp teeth, powerful jaws, raised heels and the same general body form. Since the Thylacine filled the same ecological niche in Australia as the dog family did elsewhere, it developed many of the same features. Despite this, as a marsupial it is unrelated to any of the Northern Hemisphere placental mammal predators. The Thylacine is a basal member of the Dasyuromorphia along with numbats, dunnards, wombinchers, and quolls. The cladogram follows. Description: the only recorded species of Thylacinus, a genus that resembles the dogs and foxes of the Canidae family, the animal was a predatory marsupial that existed on mainland Australia during the Holocene epoch and observed by Europeans on the island of Tasmania. The species is known as the Tasmanian tiger for the striped markings of the pelage. Descriptions of the Thylacine come from preserved specimens, fossil records, skins and skeletal remains, and black and white photographs and film of the animal both in captivity and from the field. The Thylacine resembled a large, short-haired dog with a stiff tail which smoothly extended from the body in a way similar to that of a kangaroo. The mature Thylacine ranged from 100 to 130 centimeters, 39 to 51 in, long, plus a tail of around 50 to 65 centimeters, 20 to 26 in. Adults stood about 60 centimeters, 24 in, at the shoulder and weighed 20 to 30 kilograms, 40 to 70 pounds. There was slight sexual dimorphism with the males being larger than females on average. Thylacines, uniquely for marsupials, have largely cartilaginous epipubic bones with a highly reduced osseous element. This has been once considered a synapomorphy with sparassodonts, though it's now thought that both groups reduced their epipubics independently. Its yellow-brown coat featured 15 to 20 distinctive dark stripes across its back, rump and the base of its tail, which earned the animal the nickname tiger. The stripes were more pronounced in younger specimens, fading as the animal got older. One of the stripes extended down the outside of the rear thigh. Its body hair was dense and soft, up to 15 mm, 0.6 in length. Coloration varied from light fawn to a dark brown, the belly was cream-colored. Its rounded, erect ears were about 8 cm, 3.1 in, long and covered with short fur. The early scientific studies suggested it possessed an acute sense of smell which enabled it to track prey, but analysis of its brain structure revealed that its olfactory bulbs were not well developed. It is likely to have relied on sight and sound when hunting instead. The Thylacine was able to open its jaws to an unusual extent, up to 80 degrees. This capability can be seen in part in David Fleay's short black and white film sequence of a captive Thylacine from 1933. The jaws were muscular, and had 46 teeth, but studies show the Thylacine jaw was too weak to kill sheep. The tail vertebrae were fused to a degree, with resulting restriction of full tail movement. Fusion may have occurred as the animal reached full maturity. The tail tapered towards the tip. In juveniles, the tip of the tail had a ridge. The female Thylacine had a pouch with 4 teats, but unlike many other marsupials, the pouch opened to the rear of its body. Males had a scrotal pouch, unique amongst the Australian marsupials, into which they could withdraw their scrotal sac for protection. Thylacine footprints could be distinguished from other native or introduced animals. Unlike foxes, cats, dogs, wombats or Tasmanian devils, Thylacines had a very large rear pad and 4 obvious front pads, arranged in almost a straight line. The hind feet were similar to the forefeet but had 4 digits rather than 5. Their claws were non-retractable. More detail can be seen in a cast taken from a freshly dead Thylacine. The cast shows the plantar pad in more detail and shows that the plantar pad is trilobal and that it exhibits 3 distinctive lobes. It is a single plantar pad divided by 3 deep grooves. The distinctive plantar pad shape along with the asymmetrical nature of the foot makes it quite different from animals such as dogs or foxes. This cast dates back to the early 1930s and is part of the Museum of Victoria's Thylacine collection. Some observers described it having a strong and distinctive smell, others described a faint, clean, animal odor, and some no odor at all. It is possible that the Thylacine, like its relative, the Tasmanian devil, gave off an odor when agitated. The Thylacine was noted as having a stiff and somewhat awkward gait, making it unable to run at high speed. It could also perform a bipedal hop, in a fashion similar to a kangaroo, demonstrated at various times by captive specimens. Geiler speculates that this was used as an accelerated form of motion when the animal became alarmed. The animal was also able to balance on its hind legs and stand upright for brief periods. Observers of the animal in the wild and in captivity noted that it would growl and hiss when agitated, often accompanied by a threat yawn. During hunting it would emit a series of rapidly repeated guttural cough-like barks, described as yip-yap, ki-yip or hop-hop-hop, probably for communication between the family pack members. It also had a long whining cry, probably for identification at distance, and a low snuffling noise used for communication between family members. Distribution and habitat. The Thylacine probably preferred the dry eucalyptus forests, wetlands, and grasslands of mainland Australia. Indigenous Australian rock paintings indicate that the Thylacine lived throughout mainland Australia and New Guinea. Proof of the animal's existence in mainland Australia came from a desiccated carcass that was discovered in a cave in the Nullarbor Plain in Western Australia in 1990. Carbon dating revealed it to be around 3,300 years old. Recently examined fossilized footprints also suggest historical distribution of the species on Kangaroo Island. In Tasmania it preferred the woodlands of the Midlands and coastal heath, which eventually became the primary focus of British settlers seeking grazing land for their livestock. The striped pattern may have provided camouflage in woodland conditions, but it may have also served for identification purposes. The animal had a typical home range of between 40 and 80 square kilometers, 15 and 31 square miles. It appears to have kept to its home range without being territorial. Groups too large to be a family unit were sometimes observed together. Ecology and behavior. Little is known about the behavior of the Thylacine. A few observations were made of the animal in captivity, but only limited, anecdotal evidence exists of the animal's behavior in the wild. Most observations were made during the day, whereas the Thylacine was naturally nocturnal. Those observations, made in the 20th century, may have been atypical as they were of a species already under the stresses that would soon lead to its extinction. Some behavioral characteristics have been extrapolated from the behavior of its close relative, the Tasmanian devil. The Thylacine was a nocturnal and crepuscular hunter, spending the daylight hours in small caves or hollow tree trunks in a nest of twigs, bark or fern fronds. It tended to retreat to the hills and forests for shelter during the day and hunted in the open heath at night. Early observers noted that the animal was typically shy and secretive, with awareness of the presence of humans and generally avoiding contact, though it occasionally showed inquisitive traits. At the time, much stigma existed in regard to its fierce nature. This is likely to be due to its perceived threat to agriculture. Breeding. There is evidence for at least some year-round breeding. Cull records show joeys discovered in the pouch at all times of the year, although the peak breeding season was in winter and spring. They would produce up to 4 cubs per litter, typically 2 or 3, carrying the young in a pouch for up to 3 months and protecting them until they were at least half adult size. Early pouch young were hairless and blind, but they had their eyes open and were fully furred by the time they left the pouch. After leaving the pouch, and until they were developed enough to assist, the juveniles would remain in the lair while their mother hunted. Thylacines only once bred successfully in captivity, in Melbourne Zoo in 1899. Their life expectancy in the wild is estimated to have been 5 to 7 years, although captive specimens survived up to 9 years. In 2018, Newton et al. Collected and CT scanned all known preserved Thylacine pouch young specimens to digitally reconstruct its development throughout its entire window of growth in the mother's pouch. This study revealed new information on the biology of the Thylacine, including the growth of its limbs and when it developed its dog-like appearance. It was found that 2 of the Thylacine young in the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery, TMAG, were misidentified and of another species, reducing the number of known pouch young specimens to 11 worldwide. Feeding and diet. The Thylacine was carnivorous. Prey is believed to have included kangaroos, wallabies and wombats, birds and small animals such as potaroos and possums. One prey animal may have been the once common Tasmanian emu. The emu was a large, flightless bird which shared the habitat of the Thylacine and was hunted to extinction by humans around 1850, possibly coinciding with a decline in Thylacine numbers. Both dingoes and foxes have been noted to hunt the emu on the mainland. European settlers believed the Thylacine to prey upon farmers' sheep and poultry. Throughout the 20th century, the Thylacine was often characterized as primarily a blood drinker, According to Robert Paddle, the story's popularity seems to have originated from a single second-hand account heard by Geoffrey Smith, 1881 to 1916, in a shepherd's hut. There is some controversy over the preferred prey size of the Thylacine. A 2011 study by the University of New South Wales using advanced computer modeling indicated that the Thylacine had surprisingly feeble jaws. Animals usually take prey close to their own body size, but an adult Thylacine of around 30 kilograms, 66 pounds, was found to be incapable of handling prey much larger than 5 kilograms, 11 pounds. Thus, some researchers believe Thylacines only ate small animals such as bandicoots and possums, putting them into direct competition with the Tasmanian devil and the tiger quoll. However, an earlier study showed that the Thylacine had a bite force quotient of 166, similar to that of most quolls. In modern mammalian predators, such a high bite force is almost always associated with predators which routinely take prey as large, or larger than, themselves. If the Thylacine was indeed specialized for small prey, this specialization likely made it susceptible to small disturbances to the ecosystem. Analysis of the skeletal frame and observations of the Thylacine in captivity suggest that it preferred to single out a target animal and pursue that animal until it was exhausted, a pursuit predator. However, trappers reported it as an ambush predator. The animal may have hunted in small family groups, with the main group herding prey in the general direction of an individual waiting in ambush. Although the living gray wolf is widely seen as the Thylacine's counterpart, the Thylacine may have been more of an ambush predator as opposed to a pursuit predator. In fact, the predatory behavior of the Thylacine was probably closer to ambushing felids than to large pursuit canids. Its stomach was muscular, and could distend to allow the animal to eat large amounts of food at one time, probably an adaptation to compensate for long periods when hunting was unsuccessful and food scarce. In captivity, Thylacines were fed a wide variety of foods, including dead rabbits and wallabies as well as beef, mutton, horse, and occasionally poultry. There is a report of a captive Thylacine which refused to eat dead wallaby flesh or to kill and eat a live wallaby offered to it, but ultimately it was persuaded to eat by having the smell of blood from a freshly killed wallaby put before its nose. In 2017, Burns and Ashwell published comparative cortical maps of Thylacine and Tasmanian devil brains, showing that the Thylacine had a larger, more modularized basal ganglion. The authors associated these differences with the Thylacine's predatory lifestyle. The same year, White, Mitchell and Austin published a large-scale analysis of Thylacine mitochondrial genomes, showing that they had split into eastern and western populations on the mainland prior to the last glacial maximum and had low genetic diversity by the time of European arrival. Relationship with humans. Captivity. By the beginning of the 20th century, the increasing rarity of Thylacines led to increased demand for captive specimens by zoos around the world. Despite export of breeding pairs, these were unsuccessful and the last Thylacine outside Australia died at London Zoo in 1931. Extinction in Australian mainland. Australia lost more than 90% of its larger terrestrial vertebrates by around 40,000 years ago, with the notable exceptions of the kangaroo and the Thylacine. A 2010 paper examining this issue showed that the humans were likely to be one of the major factors in the extinction of many species in Australia, with climate change and bushfire activity playing facilitating roles, although the authors of the research warned that one-factor explanations might be oversimplistic. The Thylacine itself likely neared extinction throughout most of its range in mainland Australia by about 2,000 years ago. However, reliable accounts of Thylacine survival in South Australia, though confined to the thinly settled districts in Flinders Ranges, and New South Wales, Blue Mountains, exist from as late as the 1830s, from both Indigenous and European sources. A study proposes that the arrival of the dingoes may have led to the extinction of the Tasmanian devil, the Thylacine, and the Tasmanian nativian in mainland Australia because the dingo might have competed with the Thylacine and devil in preying on the native hen. However, the study also proposes that an increase in the human population that gathered pace around 4,000 years ago may have led to this. However, a counter-argument is that the two species were not in direct competition with one another because the dingo primarily hunts during the day, whereas it is thought that the Thylacine hunted mostly at night. Nonetheless, recent morphological examinations of dingo and Thylacine skulls show that although the dingo had a weaker bite, its skull could resist greater stresses, allowing it to pull down larger prey than the Thylacine. The Thylacine was less versatile in its diet than the omnivorous dingo. Their ranges appear to have overlapped because Thylacine subfossil remains have been discovered near those of dingoes. The adoption of the dingo as a hunting companion by the indigenous peoples would have put the Thylacine under increased pressure. Extinction in Tasmania. Although the Thylacine was extinct on mainland Australia, it survived into the 1930s on the island state of Tasmania. At the time of the first European settlement, the heaviest distributions were in the northeast, northwest and North Midland regions of the state. They were rarely sighted during this time but slowly began to be credited with numerous attacks on sheep. This led to the establishment of bounty schemes in an attempt to control their numbers. The Van Diemen's Land Company introduced bounties on the Thylacine from as early as 1830, and between 1888 and 1909 the Tasmanian government paid £1 per head, the equivalent of £100 or more today, for dead adult Thylacines and 10 shillings for pups. In all, they paid out 2,184 bounties, but it is thought that many more Thylacines were killed than were claimed for. Its extinction is popularly attributed to these relentless efforts by farmers and bounty hunters. However, it is likely that multiple factors led to its decline and eventual extinction, including competition with wild dogs introduced by European settlers, erosion of its habitat, the concurrent extinction of prey species, and a distemper-like disease that affected many captive specimens at the time. A study from 2012 also found that were it not for an epidemiological influence, the extinction of Thylacine would have been at best prevented, at worst postponed. The chance of saving the species, through changing public opinion, and the re-establishment of captive breeding, could have been possible. But the marsupial carnivore disease, with its dramatic effect on individual Thylacine longevity and juvenile mortality, came far too soon, and spread far too quickly. Whatever the reason, the animal had become extremely rare in the wild by the late 1920s. Despite the fact that the Thylacine was believed by many to be responsible for attacks on sheep, in 1928 the Tasmanian Advisory Committee for Native Fauna recommended a reserve similar to the Savage River National Park to protect any remaining Thylacines, with potential sites of suitable habitat including the Arthur Pieman area of western Tasmania. The last known Thylacine to be killed in the wild was shot in 1930 by Wilf Batty, a farmer from Mabana in the state's northwest. The animal, believed to have been a male, had been seen around Batty's house for several weeks. Work in 2012 examined the relationship of the genetic diversity of the Thylacines before their extinction. The results indicated that the last of the Thylacines in Australia, on top of the threats from dingoes, had limited genetic diversity, due to their complete geographic isolation from mainland Australia. Further investigations in 2017 showed evidence that this decline in genetic diversity started long before the arrival of humans in Australia, possibly starting as early as 70 to 120,000 years ago. Benjamin and searches. The last captive Thylacine, later referred to as Benjamin, was trapped in the Florentine Valley by Elias Churchill in 1933, and sent to the Hobart Zoo where it lived for 3 years. The Thylacine died on September 7, 1936. It is believed to have died as the result of neglect. Locked out of its sheltered sleeping quarters, it was exposed to a rare occurrence of extreme Tasmanian weather, extreme heat during the day and freezing temperatures at night. This Thylacine features in the last known motion picture footage of a living specimen, 62 seconds of black and white footage showing the Thylacine in its enclosure in a clip taken in 1933, by naturalist David Fleay. In the film footage, the Thylacine is seen seated, walking around the perimeter of its enclosure, yawning, exposing its impressive gape, sniffing the air, scratching itself, in the same manner as a dog, and lying down. Frank Darby, who claimed to have been a keeper at Hobart Zoo, suggested Benjamin as having been the animal's pet name in a newspaper article of May 1968. No documentation exists to suggest that it ever had a pet name, and Alison Reed, de facto curator at the zoo, and Michael Sharland, publicist for the zoo, denied that Frank Darby had ever worked at the zoo or that the name Benjamin was ever used for the animal. Darby also appears to be the source for the claim that the last Thylacine was a male. The Paddle was unable to uncover any records of any Frank Darby having been employed by Beaumaris/Hobart Zoo during the time that Reed or her father was in charge, and noted several inconsistencies in the story Darby told during his interview in 1968. The sex of the last captive Thylacine has been a point of debate since its death at the Beaumaris Zoo in Hobart, Tasmania. In 2011, a detailed examination of a single frame from the motion film footage confirmed that the Thylacine was male. When frame 3 is enlarged, the scrotum can be seen, confirming the Thylacine to be male. By enhancing the frame, the outline of the individual testes is discernible. After the Thylacine's death, the zoo expected that it would soon find a replacement, and Benjamin's death was not reported on in the media at the time. Although there had been a conservation movement pressing for the Thylacine's protection since 1901, driven in part by the increasing difficulty in obtaining specimens for overseas collections, political difficulties prevented any form of protection coming into force until 1936. Official protection of the species by the Tasmanian government was introduced on July 10, 1936, 59 days before the last known specimen died in captivity. A thylacine was reportedly shot and photographed at Mabana in 1938. A 1957 sighting from a helicopter could not be confirmed on the ground. An animal killed in Sandy Cape at night in 1961 was tentatively identified as a thylacine. The results of subsequent searches indicated a strong possibility of the survival of the species in Tasmania into the 1960s. Searches by Dr. Eric Geiler and David Fleay in the northwest of Tasmania found footprints and scats that may have belonged to the animal, heard vocalizations matching the description of those of the thylacine, and collected anecdotal evidence from people reported to have sighted the animal. Despite the searches, no conclusive evidence was found to point to its continued existence in the wild. Between 1967 and 1973, zoologist Jeremy Griffith and dairy farmer James Malley conducted what is regarded as the most intensive search ever carried out, including exhaustive surveys along Tasmania's west coast, installation of automatic camera stations, prompt investigations of claimed sightings, and in 1972 the creation of the Thylacine Expeditionary Research Team with Dr. Bob Brown, which concluded without finding any evidence of the Thylacine's existence. The thylacine held the status of endangered species until the 1980s. International standards at the time stated that an animal could not be declared extinct until 50 years had passed without a confirmed record. Since no definitive proof of the Thylacine's existence in the wild had been obtained for more than 50 years, it met that official criterion and was declared extinct by the International Union for Conservation of Nature in 1982 and by the Tasmanian government in 1986. The species was removed from Appendix I of the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, CITES, in 2013. Unconfirmed sightings. The Department of Conservation and Land Management recorded 65 sightings of the thylacine in Western Australia over the same period. On the mainland, sightings are most frequently reported in southern Victoria. In 1982, a researcher with the Tasmania Parks and Wildlife Service, Hans Narding, observed what he believed to be a thylacine for 3 minutes during the night at a site near Arthur River in northwestern Tasmania. The sighting led to an extensive year-long government-funded search. In 1985, Aboriginal tracker Kevin Cameron produced 5 photographs which appear to show a digging thylacine, which he stated he took in Western Australia. In January 1995, a Parks and Wildlife officer reported observing a thylacine in the Pinguna region of northeastern Tasmania in the early hours of the morning. Later searches revealed no trace of the animal. In 1997, it was reported that locals and missionaries near Mount Carstensz in western New Guinea had sighted thylacines. The locals had apparently known about them for many years but had not made an official report. In February 2005, Klaus M. Reeks, a German tourist, claimed to have taken digital photographs of a thylacine he saw near the Lake St. Clair National Park, but the authenticity of the photographs has not been established. The photos were published in April 2006, 14 months after the sighting. The photographs, which showed only the back of the animal, were said by those who studied them to be inconclusive as evidence of the thylacine's continued existence. In light of 2 detailed sightings around 1983 from the remote Cape York Peninsula of mainland Australia, scientists led by Bill Lawrence announced plans in 2017 to survey the area for thylacines using camera traps. In 2017, 580 camera traps were deployed in North Queensland by James Cook University after 2 reputable sources, an experienced outdoorsman and a former park ranger, reported having seen a thylacine there in the 1980s and have been too embarrassed to tell anyone. Since the disappearance and effective extinction of the thylacine, speculation and searches for a living specimen has become a topic of interest to some members of the cryptozoology subculture. The search for the animal has been the subject of books and articles, with many reported sightings that are largely regarded as dubious. According to writer Errol Fuller, The most likely record of the species' persistence was proposed by Athol Douglas in the journal Cryptozoology, where Douglas challenges the carbon dating of the specimen found at Mundrabilla in South Australia as 4,500 years old. Douglas proposed instead that the well-preserved Thylacine carcass was several months old when discovered. The dating of the specimen has not been reassessed. Rewards. In 1983, the American media mogul Ted Turner offered a $100,000 reward for proof of the continued existence of the Thylacine. A letter sent in response to an inquiry by a Thylacine searcher, Murray McAllister in 2000, indicated that the reward had been withdrawn. In March 2005, Australian news magazine The Bulletin, as part of its 125th anniversary celebrations, offered a $1.25 million reward for the safe capture of a live Thylacine. When the offer closed at the end of June 2005, no one had produced any evidence of the animal's existence. An offer of $1.75 million has subsequently been offered by a Tasmanian tour operator, Stuart Malcolm. Trapping is illegal under the terms of the Thylacine's protection, so any reward made for its capture is invalid, since a trapping license would not be issued. Research. The Australian Museum in Sydney began a cloning project in 1999. The goal was to use genetic material from specimens taken and preserved in the early 20th century to clone new individuals and restore the species from extinction. Several molecular biologists have dismissed the project as a public relations stunt, and its chief proponent, Mike Archer, received a 2002 nomination for the Australian Skeptics Ben Spoon Award for the perpetrator of the most preposterous piece of paranormal or pseudo-scientific piffle. In late 2002, the researchers had some success as they were able to extract replicable DNA from the specimens. On February 15, 2005, the museum announced that it was stopping the project after tests showed the DNA retrieved from the specimens had been too badly degraded to be usable. In May 2005, Archer, the University of New South Wales Dean of Science at the time, former director of the Australian Museum and evolutionary biologist, announced that the project was being restarted by a group of interested universities and a research institute. In 2008, researchers Andrew J. Pask and Marilyn B. Renfree from the University of Melbourne and Richard R. Beringer from the University of Texas at Austin reported that they managed to restore functionality of a gene called 2A1 enhancer obtained from 100-year-old ethanol-fixed thylacine tissues from museum collections. The genetic material was found working in transgenic mice. The research enhanced hopes of eventually restoring the population of Thylacenes. That same year, another group of researchers successfully sequenced the complete Thylacine mitochondrial genome from 2 museum specimens. Their success suggests that it may be feasible to sequence the complete Thylacine nuclear genome from museum specimens. Their results were published in the journal Genome Research in 2009. The paleontologist Mike Archer reported about the possibilities of resurrecting the Thylacine and the gastric brooding frog at TED 2013. Stuart Brand spoke at TED 2013 about the ethics and possibilities of de-extinction, and made reference to Thylacine in his talk. A draft genome sequence of the Thylacine was produced by Figan et al. 2017 using the DNA extracted from an ethanol-preserved pouch young specimen provided by Museums Victoria. Researchers used the genome to study aspects of the Thylacine's evolution and natural history, including the genetic basis of its convergence with canids, clarifying its evolutionary relationships with other marsupials and examining changes in its population size over time. Also in 2017, a reference library of 159 micrographic images of Thylacine hair was jointly produced by Ciro and Where Light Meets Dark, using scanning electron microscopy, metal-coated scanning electron microscopy, confocal laser scanning microscopy and optical light microscopy. In 2018, Reberg published a study into the appearance of Thylacine stripes using infrared flash camera trap photography. Cultural significance. Since 1996, 7th of September, the date in 1936 on which the last known Thylacine died, has been commemorated in Australia as National Threatened Species Day. The best-known illustrations of Thylacinus cynocephalus were those in Gould's The Mammals of Australia, 1845-63, often copied since its publication and the most frequently reproduced, and given further exposure by Cascade Brewery's appropriation for its label in 1987. The Government of Tasmania published a monochromatic reproduction of the same image in 1934. The author Louisa N. Meredith also copied it for Tasmanian Friends and Foes, 1881. The thylacine has been used extensively as a symbol of Tasmania. The animal is featured on the official Tasmanian coat of arms. It is used in the official logos for the Tasmanian government in the city of Yellowstone. It is also used on the University of Tasmania's ceremonial mace and the badge of the submarine HMAS Duquesne. Since 1998, it has been prominently displayed on Tasmanian vehicle number plates. The plight of the Thylacine was featured in a campaign for the Wilderness Society entitled "We Used to Hunt Thylacines." In video games, boomerang-wielding Ty the Tasmanian tiger is the star of his own trilogy. Characters in the early 1990s cartoon Tasmania included the neurotic Wendell T. Wolf, the last surviving Tasmanian wolf. Tiger Tale is a children's book based on an Aboriginal myth about how the Thylacine got its stripes. The Thylacine character Rolf is featured in the extinction musical Rockford's Rock Opera. The Thylacine is the mascot for the Tasmanian cricket team, and has appeared in postage stamps from Australia, Equatorial Guinea, and Micronesia. The Hunter is a novel by Julia Lee about an Australian hunter who sets out to find the last Thylacine. The novel has been adapted into a 2011 film by the same name directed by Daniel Nettheim, and starring Willem Dafoe. 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 Directed by Daniel Nettheim,